Hello, it's time for a little tea and tea for truth in education. I'm Dr. Deborah Owens, literacy professor and education policy researcher. Thank you for spending some time with me as I discuss a nation at risk. This started out as a two-part series. However, I quickly realized that this story is very important and somewhat multifaceted and would require further episodes. As a note, the information I'll share with you is well researched and can be found in my book, The Origins of the Common Core. So, if you'd like to review my resources or learn more about education policy, please check out my book. In the first part of my series, I'll provide the backstory for the creation of a nation at risk and its somewhat ironic origin. In a two-part series, I'll discuss A Nation at Risk, a bestseller produced by the federal government in 1983. This report, which still sells today in paperback book form, created a firestorm of cataclysmic headlines and reports about the dismal condition of our public school system in the United States and the need for drastic and immediate reform. The full title of the report is A Nation at Risk, the Imperative for Educational Reform, an open letter to the American people, a report to the nation and the Secretary of Education. The title pretty much sums up the theme that resonates throughout the report and alludes to one of the most ironic stories in education policy, as it states that it's a report to the nation and the Secretary of Education. Irony is defined by Merriam-Webster Dictionary as incongruity between the actual result of a sequence of events and the normal or expected results. I've been fascinated with the story of a nation at risk for quite some time because it represents a distinct point in education policy and speaks to so much of the education reform iterations we've seen since the 1980s. In A Nation at Risk Part 1, I'll share with you the story of its creation and the irony of the fallout that resulted from its publication. Most people don't realize that the Federal Department of Education didn't exist until October 1979. When President Jimmy Carter took office in 1977, he vowed to elevate education governance to a cabinet-level position. At that time, the governance of federal education policy was primarily overseen by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW. But with the creation of the Department of Education, education policymakers would gain credibility and power by making the secretary of the department a cabinet-level position with a seat at the table when all federal policies were being made. President Carter signed the Department of Education Organization Act into law on October 17, 1979, thus creating the 13th Cabinet Department. In his November 17th statement, following the signing of the Department of Education Organization law, President Carter acknowledged that the primary responsibility for education should rest with states, localities, and private institutions that have made our nation's educational system the best in the world. The federal government, however, he asserted, had failed to effectively support education and had confused its role as junior partner with that of silent partner, providing only part-time support for American schools, while increasing added burdens to schools through regulations. The newly formed Department of Education would allow the federal government to meet its responsibilities in education more effectively, more efficiently, and more responsively. The American people, stated President Carter, should receive a better return on their investment in education. Within a year, President Carter lost his bid for a second term in the White House to Ronald Reagan. When President Ronald Reagan spoke at his inauguration in January 1981, He famously stated, "Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem." He vowed to shrink the size of the federal government. This would include abolishing the Department of Education. He was intent on returning control over education to states, providing vouchers and tax credits for students to attend private schools, and restricting any limitations on school prayer. President Reagan would learn, however, that abolishing a federal department and a cabinet level position would not be a simple task. You see, in order to fulfill his campaign promise to abolish the Department of Education, Reagan would have to appoint a Secretary of Education to oversee the project. He appointed Terrel Bell, who had formerly served as Commissioner of Education within Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, under Presidents Nixon and Ford. Terrel Bell understood that his primary responsibility was basically to eliminate his own position as Secretary of Education by abolishing the department he was appointed to oversee, a department that had only been created a year and 3 months earlier. Early in his tenure as Secretary of the Department of Education, Bell worked with President Reagan's administration to draft a bill that would abolish his department and replace it with a foundation that would maintain authority and governance over public education at the federal level. However, legislative efforts to eliminate the department were unsuccessful. Members of Congress refused to support any proposed bill to fulfill President Reagan's efforts to eliminate the Department of Education. Even conservative congressional leaders who supported Reagan's conservative economic and social policies refused to support the bill. In 1981, when it was clear that legislative efforts to abolish the Department of Education were doomed to failure, Bell proposed the formation of a presidentially appointed commission to study the current state of education in America and prepare a report for the government. This commission would be named the National Commission on Excellence in Education. Bell imagined that the commission's final report would be the final task for the Department of Education. Instead, however, and this is the irony, the NCEE's final report, A Nation at Risk, would set off an educational firestorm that would radically change America's education landscape, increasing the power and influence of the federal government over education in all 50 states, while ensuring the Department of Education's continued existence. Terrel Bell called upon David Pierpont Gardner, president of the University of Utah and president-elect of the University of California, to chair the National Commission. 17 other commission members would eventually be appointed from across the country, representing what Bell considered to be a balanced group of liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, males and females, minorities, educators, and non-educators. 3 of these appointees were, like Gardner, serving as presidents of institutions of higher education, the presidents of Xavier University, Yale University, and Highline Community College. 3 members of the commission were affiliated with school boards. One was the former Commissioner of Education for the state of Nebraska. 2 school principals served on the commission. 1 superintendent of a public school district served on the commission as well. The interests of the science community were served by a professor of physics and the history of science at Harvard University, and a Nobel laureate and professor of chemistry at the University of California. Business interests were represented by a former chairman of the board for Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey. In addition, a past president of the Foundation for Teaching Economics in San Francisco and former governor of Minnesota was appointed to the commission. The only teacher on the commission was Jay Summer, a foreign language teacher who had been honored as Teacher of the Year for 1981 and 82. Representing the views of parents was Annette Kirk. Annette Kirk was the only person Reagan personally nominated for the commission. A one-time New York City school teacher, she was the wife of Russell Kirk, one of the founders of the modern conservative movement, and has been called one of President Reagan's favorite philosophers. Russell Kirk had been vocal in his opposition to the very institution of public schools. This will become significant upon the first presentation of A Nation at Risk by President Reagan. In the next installment of my series on A Nation at Risk, I'll discuss the research that culminated in what would become a highly contentious and impactful report, and why I, as well as other researchers, have continued to question why A Nation at Risk became the bedrock of education reform in the United States. Could it be that the research, the National Commission on Excellence in Education, was not quite valid as a basis for condemning our education system?